Good afternoon and a very warm welcome here at the ESN Group in the European Parliament, the Europe of Sovereign Nations Group, of which the AfD, Alternative for Germany, is also a member. In February 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. Since then, President Putin has been classified as an enemy of Europe, indeed, as a highly dangerous enemy. The EU, as well as the member states, their governments, militaries and media, keep promoting the assessment that Russia may attack an EU and NATO member state in 2030 or even as early as 2029. The reason given for this new Russian aggressiveness is a reawakening Russian imperialism. Putin, it is claimed, is pursuing the goal of restoring the size, power and supposed glory of the Russian Empire. As a consequence, the EU has, for the first time in its history, appointed a dedicated Commissioner for Defense. In addition, the EU has launched extensive programs designed to ensure that Europe invests more and in a more coordinated manner in defense. These include the Rearm Europe package, which was quickly renamed Preparedness 2030 in order to sound less martial. By 2030, 800 billion euros, almost 1 trillion, are to be spent on defense purposes and military equipment. What is remarkable is that in these programs, Ukraine is consistently treated as if it were a member state of the EU. Indeed, almost as if it were an especially privileged member state. Moreover, since the inauguration of US President Donald Trump, the EU has taken on almost the entire financial burden of supporting Ukraine. This is the range of issues I would like to discuss with you today, John. You are one of the best known and most influential scholars in the world in the field of international relations. Your major work, entitled The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, is a standard reference in the field. Since 1997, you have been analyzing the situation in Ukraine. To my knowledge, you are the only scholar who predicted, as early as 2015, both the war itself and the character of the war. Therefore, dear Professor Mearsheimer, it is a particular honor and a great pleasure for me to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Hans. I'm glad to be here.
Professor Mearsheimer, the war in Ukraine lasts now since more than 4 years. Many observers, including yourself, had expected that in 2025 some decisive turn of the war might take place. However, this hasn't happened. Why, according to you, has the war lasted so long? What are the underlying reasons?
I think there are basically 2 reasons. One is that the Europeans, and to a lesser extent the Americans, have continued to back Ukraine in major ways. They've continued to provide Ukraine with weapons and with money. In a sense, the Europeans and the Americans have kept the Ukrainians in the fight. But the second reason, and I think the more important reason, is the appearance of huge numbers of drones on the battlefield. I believe that if there were no drones on the battlefield, or only a few drones over the battlefield, that the Russians would have won by now. But the fact that there's so many drones up in the air, and that drones are so effective at preventing any army down on the ground from pursuing offensive operations, has slowed the Russians down. I do believe the Russians are winning the war. The Russians are conquering more and more territory every day, but they're doing it very slowly. And they're doing it very slowly despite the fact that they outnumber the Ukrainians by a significant amount because of drones. Drones allow the Ukrainians to slow the Russians down. So I think the Russians will still win. It'll just be a slower victory than I anticipated.
You mentioned the support of the Europeans to Ukraine, the significant support of the Europeans. However, one could argue that a permanent confrontation with the Russian Federation is objectively not in the interest of European states. So in a way, it's an inexplicable behavior of the European heads of states, it appears, in putting that much effort in a total confrontation, in a new Cold War, in a new Iron Curtain, a hot Iron Curtain, going right through Europe. Why do you think are the Europeans nevertheless pursuing a course of total confrontation with the Russian leadership?
Let me just start by saying I agree completely with your point that this does not make any sense for Europe. For Europe to be in this colossal security competition with Russia and to be backing Ukraine to the hilt and making sure that this war goes on and on is not in Europe's interest. But nevertheless, the Europeans continue to go down this road. Now, what's the reason for this? It's actually quite simple, and it goes back to how you think about the origins of the Ukraine war. As you said early on, when you introduced me, the conventional wisdom in the West is that Putin is an imperialist, that he is interested in conquering Ukraine and making it part of a greater Russia. And then he is interested in conquering territory in Eastern Europe, in large part to recreate the Soviet Empire as much as possible in Eastern Europe. And of course, if he does this, he's then a threat to Western Europe. So what's happened here is that the Europeans, and this was true of the Americans as well, certainly during the Biden administration, convinced themselves that Putin is an imperialist. And therefore, they have to stop him in Ukraine. Because if they don't stop him in Ukraine, he'll not only take all of Ukraine, he'll move into Eastern Europe and maybe eventually move into Western Europe. He is a serious threat. Putin is a lot like the Soviet Union, and he has to be stopped. And it's this logic that underpins Europe's unwillingness to reach any sort of agreement with Putin, and instead to continue the fight and use Ukraine to do everything possible to weaken Russia.
Would you agree with that description of the situation, that it was mainly the United States who tried to dissolve Ukraine from its long-standing relations with Russia and to make it a Western bulwark on Russia's border, an attempt which the Europeans joined because NATO is led by the United States?
I think that if you go back to April 2008, when the fateful decision was made to bring Ukraine into NATO, it's April 2008 when all the trouble starts at the annual NATO meeting in Bucharest. What you see is that it was the Americans, it was the George W. Bush administration that was pushing very hard to bring Ukraine into NATO. And actually, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, who were both there representing, of course, Germany and France respectively, were adamantly opposed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. It's quite remarkable, but these two European leaders understood that this was a terrible decision. And in fact, Merkel later said that she understood that Putin would see Ukraine and NATO as effectively a declaration of war against Russia. It's a quite remarkable statement for Merkel to make, that she recognized in April 2008, when this fateful decision was made, that bringing Ukraine into NATO was absolutely unacceptable to Putin, and he would see it as a declaration of war. Nevertheless, as you would expect, the Americans coerced the French and the Germans and the Europeans more generally into going along with this foolish policy to bring Ukraine into NATO. And then, of course, the crisis first broke out in February of 2022. That's 8 years later. So the decision was made at Bucharest in April of 2008. Then the crisis breaks out in February 2022. And this is when the West decides to double down, including the Europeans. So as soon as the crisis breaks out in 2014, right? As soon as the crisis breaks out in 2014, the Europeans are in the fight with the Americans. And from 2014, when the crisis breaks out, until 2022, when the war breaks out, the Europeans and the Americans are working together to arm and train the Ukrainian army, and they're working hard to get Ukraine ready to join NATO. So what we see here is a situation where the Europeans, much to their credit, were initially opposed to this bad idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. But once the crisis breaks out in 2014, and certainly once the war breaks out in 2022, the Europeans are gung-ho about fighting against the Russians and helping Ukraine to win the war so that Ukraine can someday be brought into NATO.
Well, there are many scholars who agree with you that the Bucharest summit in 2008 marks kind of a turning point or a climax of a longer development, which actually reaches back into the 1990s, even into the Clinton era. Scholars like Jonathan Haslam, for instance, in his book Hubris, documents how, especially under Clinton, the idea that NATO should expand eastwards was being developed. He ascribes a particular influence to the Czech president Václav Havel, who convinced, it appears, Clinton that Russia is a permanent danger, a permanent threat to the Eastern European countries, for historical reasons, of course. How and why was the image of Russia as an antipode to the United States cultivated in the 1990s? Who were, according to you, the driving forces behind this?
Well, the truth is, Hans, I don't think in the 1990s, American policymakers, and of course it was the Clinton administration that was in power at the time, had a hostile view of Russia. This is before Putin took over. Boris Yeltsin was the president of Russia. Clinton had very good relations with Yeltsin. And the Americans were actually quite optimistic throughout the 1990s that Russia would become a democracy and it would not be a problem for the West. When a decision is made in the early 1990s to expand NATO eastward, it's not to contain Russia. This is hard to believe today from the perspective of 2026. But in the 1990s, when the Clinton administration was pushing hard to expand NATO, it was not to contain Russia. It was designed instead to spread these wonderful institutions that we had created in the Cold War, NATO and the EU, eastward. The aim was to integrate the countries of Eastern Europe into these institutions, to either turn them into democracies or make them more vibrant democracies, to create a big zone of peace that spread from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. That was the goal. Now, they were not going to bring the Russians in to the alliance at that point in time. But again, it was not an anti-Russian alliance. But after Putin comes to power and the Clinton administration leaves the scene, slowly but steadily, the Americans develop an antagonistic relationship with Putin. It's not a sudden thing, because remember, it's not until 2007 at the Munich Security Conference where Putin makes it clear that he is very angry with the Europeans and the Americans because of things like NATO expansion. That's in 2007. And you want to remember that Putin comes into power at the very end of 1999. So a full 7 years goes by before he expresses any real anger. But after 2007, things go downhill. And remember, the Bucharest NATO summit is in 2008, a year after Putin's talk at the Munich Security Conference. And after 2008, things continued to go downhill to the point today where we have a war with Russia on one side and Europe, the United States, and the Ukrainians on the other side. But what I'm saying here is it was an evolutionary process. It was a gradual process. It was not something that started in the 1990s with NATO expansion. It started in the early 2000s, not the 1990s.
How do you assess in that context that the NATO expansion eastwards was taken as the breaking of a promise given orally, not in writing, to the Russians in the context of the German reunification? There's the famous formula of NATO would not move 1 inch eastwards when Germany reunites. So is it not that even on the part of Boris Yeltsin, the subsequent expansion eastwards since 1994 was considered to be the breaking of a promise given earlier by the Americans and the Europeans?
It was clearly the breaking of a promise. And the other Russian leader who made this clear was Mikhail Gorbachev, who had negotiated the end of the Cold War. And he believed, I think for all the right reasons, that Russia had been promised that there would be no NATO expansion. I think the Russians were willing to live with NATO expansion into East Germany because East Germany would be reunited with West Germany, and it didn't make sense to have one half of Germany in NATO and the other half out. But there was to be no expansion beyond East Germany. And it wasn't long after that agreement was made that the United States broke the promise. And it was principally the Americans who broke the promise, as we were talking about before. It was the Clinton administration that did that. And again, you want to understand that it wasn't for realpolitik reasons. It wasn't because they thought Russia was a threat. They just wanted to take this order that had been established in Western Europe and extend the order eastward. And they understood that Yeltsin would be upset, but they thought that they could placate Yeltsin, and they thought that they could honestly convince Yeltsin that NATO was a benign alliance. It was a defensive alliance, and this move was not designed to threaten Russia. But of course, from Russia's point of view, NATO expansion was seen as a set of offensive measures by the West. the Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion from the beginning. And as you point out, they viewed this quite correctly as a violation of promises that had been made to then the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War.
So as you said before, this has been an evolutionary process. Are there other key events which led to that climax in 2008 when in Bucharest it was decided that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO?
Well, one other key event was the placing of ballistic missile defenses in both Romania and Poland. And when the Russians asked the Americans why they were doing that, the Americans said it was to deal with the threat from Iran. This made no sense at all. And it really worried the Russians greatly, in large part because the missiles that were being put in Eastern Europe could be used for offensive purposes against Russia. So that was another move that really bothered the Russians greatly. The other thing is that every time the Russians would try to talk to the Americans and express their concern about something the Americans were doing, the Americans just tended to dismiss the Russians out of hand and not take their arguments seriously at all. There was just no effort to placate the Russians in any meaningful way. And this started basically with the Bush administration and then extended into the Obama administration and even into the Trump administration. You know, in Donald Trump's first term in office, this is from 2017 to 2021, Trump started off trying to improve relations with Russia. But there was so much pushback in the United States that Trump ended up being hard-nosed on Russia. And in fact, it's Trump who in 2017 decided to arm the Ukrainians. The Americans, starting with Obama, were willing to train Ukrainians, but they were not willing to give them offensive armaments. Trump changed that. It's Trump who started arming the Ukrainians with offensive weapons. So you see, it starts with Bush, and it extends into Obama. And of course, it definitely extends into Biden, who of all the American presidents since the Cold War ended, has been the most hardline on Russia.
How do you see the role of Donald Rumsfeld in that context? According to Jonathan Haslam, he was a key actor in preventing the NATO 20 concept, which was under negotiation at that time. NATO 20 meant that Russia could be a permanent consultant to NATO or even become a member of NATO. It was, according to Haslam, notably Rumsfeld who objected to that. What could be the reasons that Rumsfeld assisted by a personality like Victoria Nuland to oppose so strongly to any productive cooperation with the Russian Federation?
Well, I think that both Victoria Nuland and Donald Rumsfeld are hardcore Cold Warriors. And I think they tended to look at Russia the same way they looked at the Soviet Union. And they understood the Russians were down, and their basic goal was to keep the Russians down. I think if you go back and you look at how the Clinton administration thought about the Russians, I think the Clinton administration was willing to put the Cold War aside and treat Russia as if it were a very different entity than the Soviet Union. I think that once the Bush administration comes into power, you find that you have an administration with lots of hard-nosed people in it who are willing to get tough with the Russians. Now, there were limits to how tough people like Rumsfeld and even Nuland could get with the Russians, because shortly after the Bush administration comes into power in January of 2001, you have September 2001, September 11th, and the global war on terror takes over. And you want to remember that the Russians were remarkably cooperative with the United States in terms of helping us wage the global war on terror. We were not appreciative of that at all. And we didn't see that as an opportunity to improve relations with Russia, because again, you had people like Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and others who were hardline Cold Warriors. And that's why relations began to deteriorate in the early 2000s. I'll just make one other point on this. I think that another factor that can't be underestimated here in terms of why relations between Russia and the United States went downhill after 2000 is the fact that Putin was willing to stand up to the Americans. The Americans don't like foreign leaders who stand up to the United States. They like leaders who salute and do what they're told. And Putin was not that kind of leader. And Putin was willing to play hardball with the Americans. And of course, he did this in his speech that I referred to before at Munich in 2007. And I think that irritated the Americans, the fact that Putin didn't sort of submit to American orders. And of course, when this angered the Americans and they lashed out at Putin, he stood up to them once again. And you had something of an escalation cycle here where the Americans and the Russians, and here we're talking about Vladimir Putin, went back and forth. And animosity between the two sides grew over the course of the early 2000s.
How does this work in detail, and who were the driving forces on the part of the media to bring about this long-term process?
Truth is that almost everybody in the media and almost everybody in the Western foreign policy establishments demonized the Russians from 2014 up to the present. It's just truly remarkable. The late historian Stephen Cohen, who was an expert on the Soviet Union, he wrote a very famous book on Bukharin, and Steve was basically a man of the left. And he was sympathetic in a lot of ways to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And Steve told me that during the Cold War, it was much easier for him to get an article that was somewhat sympathetic to the Soviet Union in the New York Times or in the mainstream media more generally than it was in 2016 or 2015, when opinion toward Russia inside the media had turned against Russia in profound ways, which made it impossible for people like Steve and for people like me to get published in the mainstream media, because people really just didn't want to hear what we had to say. It's really quite remarkable. So Steve is saying that the media was more variegated. There was more variance in terms of what the media would allow to be published, the mainstream media we're talking about here, during the Cold War than after 2014 in the United States and in the West more generally. And I would argue that situation remains in place today. If you read, most of the major news outlets or newspapers in the United States, it's quite remarkable the extent to which animosity towards Russia and belief that Putin is an imperialist who is interested in conquering not only all of Ukraine, but huge chunks of Europe, dominates the headlines.
How do you assess, to address the role of yet another actor in the game, how do you assess the role of think tanks? There is, for instance, a famous paper of the RAND Corporation published in 2019. There's a long version and a short version, and the short version of this paper is entitled Overextending and Disbalancing Russia. I mean, this is a program which includes many aspects of how to bring about a disbalancing and an overextending of Russia. So in a think tank like RAND Corporation, many people work together on grand strategies, isn't it? So how do you assess the role of the think tanks like the RAND Corporation to bring about the policy which finally led to escalation and to war?
Well, the RAND Corporation is a bit different than a lot of other think tanks because the RAND Corporation is very closely tied to the military-industrial complex, or it's very closely tied to the government. It does a lot of government-funded research. But I think there's no question, if you look at those various reports that RAND has done on how to deal with Russia, it's quite clear that RAND has contributed in important ways to fostering bad relations between Russia on one side and the United States on the other. But if you go to the other think tanks, the think tanks in Washington, D.C., that are not as closely tied to the administration, things like the AEI, that's the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution, and so forth and so on. You also see that those think tanks are remarkably hard line on the Russian threat. It's quite remarkable. As I said before, inside not only the media, but the foreign policy establishment, right? What you see is almost unanimity in terms of how people in those institutions think about Putin and think about Russia. And they see Putin as an imperialist. So you're not going to get that much variation between RAND and AEI and Brookings and the Hudson Institute and so forth and so on. There are a few think tanks, not many, but a few think tanks, the most prominent of which is the Quincy Institute, where you actually do find people who have views that look like my views or Steve Cohen's views. But aside from Quincy and maybe one or two other small think tanks in Washington, it's quite amazing the extent to which the conventional wisdom is firmly ingrained in the minds of almost everyone who operates inside those think tanks.
You just mentioned the foreign policy establishment, and I remember that you addressed this establishment a number of times. It's a tremendous influence on the presidents proper, to the extent that you argue an American president cannot do what he wants in foreign policy. How do the mechanisms look like through which the deep state and the foreign policy establishment can exert leverage over an incumbent president?
Let me make a couple points, Hans. I think that for every president, including President Trump in his first term, that individual was greatly limited in terms of what he could do to shift foreign policy from what it was when that president moved into the White House. There were real limits. And President Trump talked about this all the time. He felt that in his first term from 2017 to 2021, he was hamstrung by the deep state. The deep state thwarted him at many, many points in his presidency. However, he vowed that if he got reelected, he would change things in his second term. And he has done that. So I think that there is no president in our history, in America's history, who has been as free of the deep state as President Trump in his second term. So it's just very important to understand that the deep state is profoundly influential almost all the time, but not with President Trump in his second term. He is pretty much free to do what he wants, which I'm not saying is a good thing, but it is, I think, a fact. So that's point one. Point two is that a president, when he comes into office, has to appoint a whole series of advisors. And those advisors come out of the deep state, they come out of the foreign policy establishment. And those people greatly influence what the president does on a day-to-day basis. Let me give you an example that I think highlights this nicely. President Obama had opposed the Iraq War in 2003. It was highly unusual for any politician to oppose the Iraq War in 2003. He opposed it. Then he gets elected in 2008. And when he comes into office, he looks around for people that he could appoint to positions like Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State for this or for that, Secretary of Defense. All these positions have to be filled. Can President Obama find anyone who opposed the Iraq War? The answer is no. So he ends up appointing a whole slew of people to critically important foreign policy positions who favored the Iraq War that he opposed, in large part because he can't find anybody who opposed the Iraq War. So what you see is that inside the deep state, inside the foreign policy establishment, and these two things overlap, of course, there is a lot of unanimity. And any president who is at the top of the pyramid has to deal with all those people down below who are very important in helping him formulate policy and execute policy. So you get someone like President Obama who comes in, and even President Trump in his first term, who has all sorts of new ideas about how we should change the foreign policy. And that president finds out that it's not so easy to do because he has to rely on his advisors. And those advisors all sing from the same page.
So why does he not make use of the instruments that would bring, that are available to him and that would bring the war to a rapid end? For example, shutting down Starlink for Ukraine, discontinuing the provision of intelligence data, prohibiting support activities by private companies such as Palantir, Anduril and others. He could do that. Why doesn't he do it?
Well, we don't want to forget that the Europeans, almost to a person, the Europeans, and most of the foreign policy establishment in the United States would be adamantly opposed. So he would have opposition. But as I said before, he came into office in his second term fully aware of that opposition, and he was determined to not let that opposition get in the way. But I just want to emphasize that the opposition was there. And that tells you that he had to be very clever. he had to be a Machiavelli to overcome the Europeans and the American foreign policy establishment. And the fact is that President Trump is basically incompetent when it comes to doing diplomacy and when it comes to running the ship of state. He said he was going to shut down the Ukraine war. He failed. He said he was going to shut down the Gaza war and then the Gaza genocide. He failed. He said he's going to shut down the Iran war. He failed. He said he was going to win the Iran war. He failed. So President Trump has done, if you look carefully, a terrible job at using those levers that he has to bring these various wars to a conclusion. And here we're talking, of course, mainly about the Ukraine war. I believe he could have shut the war down.
Right.
He could have used some of those levers that you described in your question to me. There's no question about that. But he did not. And part of it has to do with the fact that the Europeans resisted and the foreign policy establishment in the United States resisted. But he understood that was going to be the case going in. And he had a lot of levers that he could have used if he were really a clever strategist to shut down the Ukraine war. But he never came close. It's very important to understand that. He never came close to shutting down the Ukraine war. And Putin, by the way, wanted to shut the war down. And he wanted to accommodate Trump. But Trump couldn't work it out. And by the way, you see the same thing with regard to Iran now. Trump has been trying to shut down the Iran war, and he can't do it. And it's because he is simply not very competent at diplomacy.
Could it be also, John, that the present situation in a way is quite comfortable and profitable for the United States? After all, they are still sending weapons, armament to Ukraine, but the Europeans are paying for it. So the American, US arms industry has huge profits from all these orders coming from Ukraine, being allowed by President Trump and being paid for by the Europeans. In a way, it's an ideal situation for Trump because he can argue, of course I support Ukraine, I'm sending the armaments they are asking for. At the same time, the Europeans pay for it. So it's in a way hard for an American president to resist that temptation, isn't it?
I think there's some truth in that, but you do want to remember that the United States is principally concerned with containing China in East Asia. And the United States has been pivoting to Asia since Donald Trump became president in 2017. Trump was the president who decided that it was time to abandon engagement with China and adopt a containment policy, which we did. And Trump pivoted to Asia in a serious way. But what's happening now is that we're sending weapons to the Middle East, mainly to Israel, and we're using weapons in the Middle East by ourselves, and we're sending weapons to Ukraine that should be sent to East Asia. So it would be in our interest to shut down the Ukraine war and send no more weapons to Ukraine, and instead go back to sending weapons to East Asia to contain China. And as far as the Iran war is concerned, the Iran war is a disaster for two reasons. First of all, it's eating up huge numbers of weapons that are needed in East Asia. We've moved Patriot batteries, THAAD batteries, a Marine Expeditionary Unit out of East Asia to the Middle East to fight the Iran war. We're pivoting away from East Asia. This is disastrous. So it's in our interest, or it's in President Trump's interest for sure, but it's in the country's interest to shut this war down for that reason, so we can go back to dealing with China. But furthermore, the greater threat regarding the Iran war is that the international economy is going to go off the precipice. This is a huge problem. President Trump has to shut that war down sooner rather than later. Otherwise, the damage that's going to be done to the international economy is going to be enormous. And of course, this includes Europe as well. The, the Ukraine-Russia war has done enormous damage already to European economies, and Germans know that very well. And therefore, you want to shut down the you want to shut down the Ukrainian-Russian war for the sake of the German economy, and you also want to shut down the Iran war for the sake of the German economy. If the Iran war goes on, if we don't have some sort of peace agreement, some sort of meaningful ceasefire by early August, we are going to be really in deep trouble in the fall. And when I say we, I don't only mean the United States, I mean Germany and Europe as well. This has to be shut down. So there's no question the arms makers may be making a profit from these various wars in Ukraine and Iran. But we have compelling reasons, both in Europe and the United States, to shut both of these conflicts down. And it's a tragedy that President Trump has not done a good job at even making some major strides forward toward that end.
Could it be that in the personnel of that establishment and of the deep state, a certain change has taken place? If we look, for instance, who are the people that surround Trump, that he takes along on his tours abroad. These are people who are entrepreneurs in the high-tech area, like Elon Musk, like Alex Karp, for instance. Both of them are strongly engaged in Ukraine. We know that the communication of the armed forces of Ukraine completely depend on the Starlink systems. We know that the data analysis for the armed forces of Ukraine and even the operation plans for Ukraine are provided by Palantir, and that for free. Alex Karp finds himself regularly in Kiev. So could it be that a structural change has taken place in the direction of the high-tech entrepreneurs who now are working at a new ideology, a new agenda for long-term power politics? Could it be that such a kind of a structural change is taking place in the direction of high-tech entrepreneurs, of new technologies which will largely define the war of the future and the power politics of the future?
I think there's no question that Trump is deeply committed to helping the so-called tech brothers succeed. He's fully on board in terms of supporting AI, quantum computing, and so forth and so on. Moreover, there's no question he has very good relations with Elon Musk and assorted other people in the high-tech industries. And we saw this when he took these people to China with him. So I think your point is correct in that sense. But where I disagree with you is I think you're right that what he has tried to do is avoid the deep state and bring in people who he trusts as close advisors, people who are not part of the formal government. But they're not, for the most part, people from the high-tech industries. They're his real estate buddies from New York, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. His two closest advisors on the foreign policy front are Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who are not part of the deep state. And actually, the reason he relies on them is because they're not part of the deep state. And you want to remember that Kushner and Witkoff have handled three different portfolios at the same time: the Palestine/Israel portfolio, the Iran portfolio, and the Russia portfolio. And they do it with hardly any staff at all, which again reflects the distrust of the deep state. So you see, what Trump has done is he's brought two of his closest friends, one of them, by the way, is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, but nevertheless, a real estate mogul in New York and a close friend of Trump's, as well as being his son-in-law. So Kushner and Witkoff are the two guys that he employs to go beyond the deep state, as you described it. This is not to deny for 1 second the importance of the Tech brothers, who he has a close relationship with. But I don't think he relies on them as much as he does on Witkoff and Kushner in the foreign policy realm.
What about organizations like USAID? Do you consider this as being part of the deep state? And does the cutting down of USAID, which was instrumental in bringing about the Euromaidan in 2013, 2014, does the cutting down of USAID contribute to a structural change taking place in the deep state and the US foreign policy establishment?
Well, I think the USAID is definitely part of the deep state. There's no getting around that. And there's no question that Trump has neutered USAID. He's greatly weakened it. I think what's going on there reflects a weakness in Trump's approach to foreign policy. I think it's very important to emphasize soft power and to do good things around the world that win hearts and minds. I'm a realist, as you know, Hans, and I believe that hard power is the most important form of power. But at the same time, you want to have soft power. And USAID was an institution inside the government that contributed to America's soft power. But President Trump doesn't like soft power. President Trump likes to slap people around. He likes to act like a bully. He likes to play hardball. And, you know, I've often said that he treats his allies, he treats Germany, France, Britain, worse than he treats adversaries. And this is not good. You want to have good relations with states as much as possible. You want to employ soft power. And I'm sure you remember a number of years ago, the Chinese got themselves into a lot of trouble with their neighbors because they engaged in what was called wolf warrior diplomacy. The Chinese did not use any soft power. They behaved towards all of the states in their region in a very heavy-handed way. They like to use or threaten to use the mailed fist. Hard power, nothing else. No velvet glove on the iron fist. And I think the Chinese came to realize this was a huge mistake. And the Chinese have abandoned wolf warrior diplomacy, and they've gotten much better at employing soft power. Now, what's happened is that the United States has gone in the direction of wolf warrior diplomacy. And President Trump would much prefer wolf warrior diplomacy to soft power. And I think that's a fundamental mistake. Again, I'm a realist. I understand the importance of hard power. I'm not making light of hard power, but I'm just saying you need more than pure hard power. You need soft power. You need the velvet glove. And I think USAID was an important instrument in helping the United States project soft power around the world. And I think it was a mistake to gut it the way President Trump did.
You just said no velvet on the iron fist. That takes me back to the situation on the battlefield. How do you explain that the Russians, the Russian leadership, Putin, to this point in time is so restrained as to the use of heavy weapons towards Ukraine and towards the Europeans?
Well, let me just say, I'm actually surprised that they have been as restrained. You want to remember that Ukraine, with help from Britain and the United States, invaded Mother Russia. This is the Kursk offensive in August of 2024. It's quite remarkable to think that Ukraine actually invaded Russia. And it also later then targeted, and here we're talking about Ukraine, targeted the strategic nuclear triad of Russia. It went after the bomber leg of the triad. It's quite remarkable. And I was surprised that the Russians did not retaliate in a much more forceful way against Ukraine, or maybe even the West. But I think the Russians calculated, this is just my surmise, I'm not sure. I think the Russians calculated that they didn't need to retaliate because the damage that was done was not that great. And that they would eventually win the war, and that's all that mattered. I think that was the calculation. Well, the Russians, I think, now believe that the damage that's being done with drones in terms of hitting civilian targets inside of Russia is getting to the point where something has to be done to stop it. The idea that the Europeans and the Ukrainians can scale up these attacks and go after civilian targets and think that they can get away with it, it's just unacceptable at this point. So now you see lots of Russians talking about retaliating in a really serious way against Ukraine and maybe even against European targets. I mean, Karaganov is saying that the time has come that we have to hit targets in Europe. These are NATO targets, and we have to hit them with conventional weapons. And if the conventional weapons don't work, maybe we'll have to use a few nuclear weapons. But we have to reestablish red lines, or maybe I should say, we have to establish red lines. We have to make it clear to the West, to the Europeans, and to the Americans that this is just unacceptable, that this can't go on. And more people in Russia are thinking that way these days, and this is a very dangerous situation.
Could it be that Russia's military capabilities below the nuclear threshold have been overestimated and are still being overestimated, that as a matter of fact, Russia is unable to win this war?
Well, if you're talking about whether Russia has the capability to conquer territory in all of Ukraine, in other words, whether it has the capability to conquer all of Ukraine and then conquer territory in Europe, which is what the West seems to think is the case, the answer is absolutely yes. Russia has struggled for 4+ years to conquer the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. This does not look like the Wehrmacht. This does not look like an army that is poised to conquer all of Ukraine, much less conquer all of Eastern Europe. It's just not going to happen. Russia does not have that kind of capability. Its army is not that formidable. So it has been overestimated in the West. But we do not want to lose sight of the fact that Russia has the capability to defeat the Ukrainian army in the eastern part of Ukraine and conquer a huge slice of territory and, in effect, turn what's left of Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. Just very important to understand that. Russia is winning the war, although slowly for sure. It is winning the war. It controls 20% of Ukrainian territory at this point in time. It's not going to lose that territory. It's going to keep it. And Ukraine is never going to become a member of NATO. So Russia will win an ugly victory against Ukraine. Now, many people in the West are saying that Ukraine has turned the tide today and Ukraine can defeat the Russians. All we have to do is stay in the fight, we in the West, stay in the fight and continue to support the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians can turn the tide. That's the opposite argument of the claim that the Russian army is so powerful that it can conquer Ukraine and all of Ukraine and conquer territory in Eastern Europe as well. So you see that the European elites speak out of both sides of their mouth. On one hand, they say that Russia is so powerful it can conquer all of Ukraine and territory in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, they say it's so weak that Ukraine can win the war. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. And the fact is, Russia does not have the wherewithal to conquer territory of any consequence in Eastern Europe. And it does have the capability to conquer Eastern Ukraine.
I fully agree with you on that, but be assured, John, that what I hear in the parliament every day is absolutely the contrary. It's that the Russian threat is being evoked almost daily, and we have to take more and stronger measures to prevent that Russia, once it has brought down Ukraine, will attack a member state of the European Union or of NATO. Could it be that, now to turn a bit to EU politics, that the war in Ukraine is a great chance for important institutions of the European Union, like the Commission, to gain more power? Since 2008, the world financial crisis, all crises that have happened since then, the euro crisis, the migration crisis, the climate change crisis, the corona crisis, and now the security crisis, they are all being used to create new EU institutions and to add to the power of the Commission. Could it be for you a possible intention of the Commission to just take advantage of the situation and to blow up the Russian threat so as to bring behind that strategic aim of the Commission the public opinion?
I think for sure that's true. I think the EU, like any institution, wants to increase the amount of power it has over the member states. And the idea that you could come up with an EU foreign policy that people who are at the top of the EU could run would be wildly attractive to those people. And of course, people in individual states or leaders in individual states would be reluctant to allow the EU to acquire that kind of power because it would limit their sovereignty. But I think there's no question that the EU sees the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to build up the power of the European Union. And there's no way any institution like the EU isn't going to be interested in increasing its powers vis-a-vis the member states.
John, there are two more questions which I would like to ask you. One concerns the interactions between the war in Ukraine and the war involving Iran. And the last question concerns your recent book entitled How States Think. And I would like to relate your main ideas here to some certain theories of elite and elite power. Let's start with the interactions between the war in Ukraine and the war involving Iran. What are, according to you, the main interactions?
Well, I think that the war against Iran has helped the Russians prospect for defeating Ukraine on the battlefield and in the air war that's taking place in that conflict. Now, what exactly am I saying? First of all, it's quite clear that the United States is expending weapons and munitions at a record rate in the war against Iran. And that means that we don't have all sorts of weapons that we had been giving to the Iranians, excuse me, to the Ukrainians that we can give to them anymore. So the flow of American weapons to Ukraine is going to be significantly reduced because we've expended so many munitions in the war in Iran. And that's going to help the Russians win the war. This is certainly true with regard to Patriot missiles. There's no question that Patriot missiles are the best missiles the Ukrainians could get to shoot down incoming Russian ballistic missiles and incoming Russian cruise missiles. But we don't have any more Pershings to give the Ukrainians. We've used so many in the Gulf War. And again, remember, we need to preserve as many of those Pershings for containing China as possible. So in terms of the flow of weaponry to Ukraine from the United States, that's going to slow down significantly with the passage of time. And the second thing that's happened as a result of the Iran war is that we have been forced, we meaning the United States, to take sanctions off Russian oil because we need Russian oil in the global oil markets. We need all the oil we can get in the global oil markets. So President Trump has basically said to the Russians, you can sell oil in global oil markets and you don't have to worry about the sanctions. This helps the Russian economy. And of course, the Ukraine war is a strain on the Russian economy. So a move like this is manna from heaven for the Russians. So I think in terms of the flow of weaponry, and I think in terms of selling Russian oil into the global market, these two moves, which are a consequence of the Iran war, help the Russians in significant ways.
And does that have an influence on how the war in Ukraine will play out in the end?
Yes, it does.
It does.
It makes me think that the Russians are destined to win this war. They're not going to conquer all of Ukraine. They're not going to win a decisive victory. I think they will take the 4 oblasts that they have annexed, and they may take some more territory. They may take territory in Kursk. They may try to take Odessa. Who knows for sure how that will play out? But the Russians will end up taking all of the territory in those 4 oblasts, I am quite sure. And that will be a devastating defeat for Ukraine. And Ukraine will not be in a position to go into NATO at any point in the future. And that too will be a victory for Russia. So Russia's going to win this war, but it's going to be a frozen conflict in the end. It's not going to be a decisive victory. And you're not going to have a meaningful peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. It's going to be a frozen conflict. And I would define that as an ugly victory for Russia.
So a frozen conflict and no meaningful peace agreement is what you expect to be the final result of the war. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think the Ukrainians will ever accept the loss of those four oblasts in the east plus Crimea. And I think that the Ukrainians will be deeply committed to getting that territory back. And the Russians, of course, will go to great lengths to make sure that that Ukrainian rump state that's left over once you get a frozen conflict is as dysfunctional as possible. And that will give the Ukrainians incentives to cause trouble with the Russians. So the decision that was made in April of 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO and then to continually pursue that decision, even when trouble first broke out in 2014 and then when the war broke out in 2022, was a catastrophic mistake. 20 or 30 years from now, historians will look back on that decision, that April 2008 decisions, as one of the most disastrous decisions made by a great power in modern history.
Now, to conclude, John, I would like to address a few theoretical questions. You've written the book How States Think, and you describe states as rational actors in an environment largely determined by security competition in an anarchic order. Now, the question I would like to ask you is whether decision makers in fact act rationally in the interest of the state, in the interest of the population of the states, or do they not rather act in the interest of their own survival as elites and of personal utility maximization?
Well, I think that there is a huge overlap between worrying about the survival of your state and worrying about your own survival as a leader. Because if your state doesn't survive, you won't survive as a leader of that state because your state will have disappeared and there will be no state to lead. So there is overlap there. I think what you're really getting at are situations where the survival of the leadership requires that leadership to do things that are not in the interests of the state. In other words, the survival of the state is subordinated in those instances to the survival of the leadership. I think there are very few cases that fit that description. I think in almost all cases, leaders see themselves as responsible for the survival of the state that they run. And I believe in almost all cases, they put the survival of the state in the first place of order on their list of priorities. Now, what can happen in some cases, and I don't want to deny this, is that people who, or let me put differently, leaders subtly conclude that what is in their own interest is also in the best interest of the state. So they don't see themselves as actually sacrificing the state's interests to facilitate their own interests because they identify their own interests with the state interests. So that can happen for sure because the mind works in very subtle ways. But I do think, by and large, Hans, that when push comes to shove, most leaders most of the time, do what they think is in the national interest, not in their own personal interest.
Well, let's take the example of Volodymyr Zelensky. As to that, could it be that Zelensky is an exception to the general rule just described by you? Because it would be more reasonable actually for the Ukrainian state and for the Ukrainian people to shut down the war as soon as possible. Whereas for the survival of Zelensky, it's better to continue as long as possible.
Let me make a couple points there. First of all, you and I and a number of other people believe that it's in Ukraine's interest to shut this war down immediately. In fact, we believe it was in Ukraine's interest to shut this war down a long time ago. Ukraine would have been much better off, in our opinion. But the fact is, Hans, there are a lot of people out there besides Zelensky who disagree with us and agree with Zelensky. And you can't make the argument that they are privileging their leadership position over the survival of the state because they're not in the leadership position. So what I'm saying to you is that the position that Zelensky has, that the war should continue, is a legitimate position. Many people hold that position in Ukraine who are not in leadership positions. So you can't say that Zelensky is the only person who holds this view, and he's holding this particular view because he wants to stay in power. I just don't think the evidence supports that. I do think, however, and I can't prove this, but I do think that with Zelensky, and by the way, I think this is true with Bibi Netanyahu in Israel as well, they identify their own interests with the interests of the state. They've just come to the conclusion the interests of the state are synonymous with my own interests. And I think you get that with Zelensky, and as I say, with Netanyahu for sure. But I can't prove that. But in both cases, you just want to understand that there are a lot of people who agree with them. Look, I think that Zelensky has mishandled the running of Ukrainian foreign policy. I think the first huge mistake he made was walking away from the Bucharest negotiations in April of 2022. I think this was a huge blunder on his part.
The Istanbul negotiations.
Yes, I'm sorry, excuse me. Yes, the Istanbul negotiations. It was a huge blunder on his part, and I think he's made a number of other blunders as well. So I'm not defending him any more than I would defend Netanyahu. But with regard to Zelensky, I don't think, again, that he's just using Ukraine and continuing the war for purely selfish purposes. Or at least I don't think he's doing that consciously.
Thank you, Professor Mearsheimer, for taking the time to answer to my questions today and sharing your insights into the complex issue of the war in Ukraine with us. Your answers have been very helpful to get a better picture of the situation and also to continue in our work here in the European Parliament the way we have done it for 2 years now. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, Hans, and thank you very much for having me on the program and asking all these excellent questions.